Alex Honnold, the free climbing maniac, has absolutely blown it out of the bloody water again with an incredible climb of the Taipei 101 tower in Taiwan. And I wanted to take this opportunity, considering the building is just so beautiful and so elegant, to take a bit of time to focus on the architecture of this incredible building. Obviously bringing in Alex Honnold where relevant, because it's going to be very relevant, that's why we're talking about it. But I'd like to share this with you. This is Adrian from the Summoned Realms Architecture and Video Game Podcast. This is actually the first time we're doing a little short clip away from the actual podcast content, but the news was huge and I just wanted to get something out. So right now, let's actually focus on the building itself, and we'll discuss some of the wider opinions and implications of this climb later. It's a 508 meters tall, over half a kilometer tall skyscraper in Taipei, in Taiwan, and it consists of 101 floors, as you could have imagined from the name 101. And it's located right in the heart of Taipei, so the capital of Taiwan. And just to understand how big of a deal this is that when this building was completed in 2004, it was the tallest building on Earth. And it was only going to be the Wiz Khalifa, no, the Burj Khalifa, which would outpace it eventually. So right now it sits as the 11th tallest building on Earth. So when you look at it, you're kind of thinking, what actual style? How would I define this building? And of course, there's a heavy Asian influence, which we can get into a little bit of a deeper dive of later. But for now, if you had to kind of summarize it just in a movement or a style of architecture, it's somewhere between postmodernism and neo-futurism. And the postmodernism part is this postmodernist motif of deciding to bring back ornament and bring back symbolism, which is a little bit more obvious and a little bit more pronounced and sometimes even ironic compared to the sleekness of modernism. And as for the neo-futurism aspect, I'm not going to say I'm an expert on it or I really know very much, but futurism very much tied in hand with modernism and that beauty and admiration for the ever-marching world and realms of technology, which existed hand in hand with modernism, sort of at the very end of the 19th century into the start of the 20th century. Neo-futurism, I'm going to presume it's sort of a recall back to that dreaming of a beautiful future which is leveraged by technology. So you can see in the achievements of this building, which we'll go into soon, with the sort of symbolic elements and the ornamental elements of postmodernism combines with this building. And this building, when you look it up and you do some research, it seems to be absolutely legendary for its structural design and the way that it deals with earthquakes and tropical storms. Bearing in mind it's built about 200 meters away from a fault line, so you can imagine why they kind of wanted to handle that with the design. So we're asking, what makes it so stable? What makes it so resilient? It's a combination of a fair few things. But first of all, it has a central structural core to it, which is a very strong structural core running through the center. But then it actually combines with having this sort of lattice structure on the outside, on the facade, or the curtain wall as we'd call it. It's called a curtain wall because it's not a wall which is sort of holding up a roof or a building as we'd imagine like structural walls to be. A curtain wall is a wall which isn't doing any structural work, and that wall is attached to something which actually gives it some structure and support. And what's happening is as you can see on the outside of the building, these parts that sort of taper out, the curtain wall is around there, but it's got its own independent sort of structure. And then that actually connects to the central core in the middle. And it's actually about 1 every 8 stories on this building where those two combine in order to give a proper rigidity, but also a bit of flexibility between the outside and the inside. And funnily enough, you see how the building has these sort of regular kind of flarings out here once. They're about every 8 stories, and so that lattice structure which combines the two, the truss structure, actually occurs about once every 8 stories. So the kind of description of this building as you look at it with that regular regimentation every 8 stories is reflecting with the structure, which is a beautiful kind of relationship to see. It's not just an arbitrary design on the outside mixed with a completely different thing on the inside. And there's a super cool part of this structure where on the very inside, but at the top, there's sort of a pendulum up there. This huge metal pendulum. I think it's something like 600 tons or something like that. And it sits there as this huge ball at the top. And you can imagine if you were holding something like a carrier bag with food or something like that, and you were just sort of letting it sway. You know how you always find the weight always finds its way just like to the center of mass, the center of gravity, and as you sway it one way, then the bag will naturally try to sway to the other way. That is what this pendulum is doing. It's a mass dampener. What is happening is, you can imagine whether it's like heavy external winds from tropical storms coming at the side of this building. You can imagine if the building is swaying one way, that pendulum is going to have this instinct to want to sway back the other way. So when the building starts to sway in one direction too much, then that pendulum inside is going to kind of hold steady and hold fast. Not in the way that it just stays still, but in the way that it counteracts against that swaying. And the pendulum's actually visible when you go inside, so you can look at this huge thing, and the might of that mass just to see it in front of you must be insane. And it just seems like an extremely bold move to build a building that's 1/2 kilometer tall and put this incredibly heavy steel ball at the top and kind of give it like its own way of just being a pendulum. So it's just incredible design. It's brilliant, and it's rather genius. So now you're thinking about the outside facade, right? And it's essentially an aluminium and glass outside curtain wall. You can see on the outside is that there's these little areas on sort of like the central parts just below the kind of part that flares out the most in the center, or even on the corners in places. You see these decorative facade elements which are also metal, and you'll have seen some of the most iconic shots where Alex Honnold is actually climbing around those things. So I'm sure a lot of you look at this building and you think, oh yeah, that's definitely an Asian building, that's definitely got like very strong Asian, whether it's Chinese or Japanese or other kinds of cultures within Asia, the elements are very clear. But the question is, what are those elements, and how do I know this? How am I not just presuming this? It's because the building actually carries a lot of sort of metaphors and symbols within it. So for instance, when you look at the thing in general, it's kind of compared to bamboo, and you'll know how bamboo kind of grows in these segments where it has these ridges, and it also handles like wind and things like that very well with certain sizes of bamboo. That's one of the elements. But maybe the most obvious one is when you're thinking of sort of Asian-styled shrines, like shrine towers, and you think of those repeating kind of roofs which sway out, that kind of flare out, that are called pagodas. And in this building, it's actually done in reverse. So instead of swaying outwards in that that swoop that goes from the top and then goes low, in this case, you've actually got something where you've got a slight flaring, but it's going from being tucked inside at the bottom of a segment and then flaring out slightly. But the motif is still there, even if it's in reverse. And now a lot of like great prosperous kind of designs that happen in places in Asia, they want to associate these things with luck and, of course, prosperity. And so there's also another metaphor here, which is where each of these segments that you can see actually look quite similar to how in ancient times Asian cultures would produce like gold ingots and things like that. They wouldn't be like the ingots that we think of that are sort of like bars in the West, but they almost look like these sort of bowls. And I don't know why they're made like that exactly, but the main heaviest stuff is at the base, but you can grab them from the top, sort of like this, I think. I'm not sure, or they're just more transportable. But people associate the segmented design with having numerous ones of these sort of ingot bowls stacked up against one another. But finally, the one it's used as a joke, but to be honest, I think it still represents a really important part of like the symbolism of the East, is that they do look like takeaway boxes that you would get from a Chinese takeaway. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think those boxes, those designs, I mean, sure, they kind of relate to these ingots in their own little way. That's why people kind of see this like divide in the interpretation. But also it's an iconic shape. It's a sort of 3D parallelogram or frustrum or some kind of shape like that. Maybe I'll have some geometric shapes over here. I don't know. So that has been a very whistle-stop tour of this building. I have to admit, I haven't seen it myself in real life. I would love to, maybe one day I would. But what I'll do is, since many of you will have been here for Alex Honnold at first, that's why we're talking about this building, because of the recent events with Alex Honnold doing the free climb, I kind of wanted to get onto reflecting about how this building relates to that free climbing element. But first of all, I do just want to say I'm quite disappointed in how a lot of the discourse over this climb has happened on Twitter, or X, obviously as it's known, because I think a lot of people are kind of being almost this sort of hipstery kind of thing, and they're saying, oh, it's not his best climb. Like, his best climb was in free solo when he climbed the El Capitan, and that's way more important than this. Like, oh, I wouldn't even bother turning up to this. Like, anybody would climb this. But I think as much as you might be a climber or someone who's obsessed with climbing, and to you, you're just used to seeing people climb, I cannot stress enough the fact that this building is 1/2 kilometer tall, and this guy climbed it without any safety gear. And there's particular elements where you can see just in the general idea that the building has this flaring segmentation, but also the part where these sort of curvy cloud-like architectural facade elements roll out from the building and take Alex Honnold like back significantly, like leaning back. And then even when he gets to the top of the tower and these certain like fins and louvers on the building, which just completely stick out and make him have to really lean back to get up. There are so many elements of this where there's like a back leaning, which is just incredibly like really raises the bar when it comes to climbing. And yes, the guy's a pro and he probably had no reason to be worried about his climb. But let's just appreciate what's being done here and let's appreciate the building. Okay, so that's the kind of rant over. What I want to talk about is relating Alex Honnold's climb to the building itself. And I think what we've learned from watching this and being able to zoom in and get into the details is that many of these things with the climbing of a building, of an architectural piece, is different from when you're climbing the natural world, like cliffs and things like that. And even when you're at climbing kind of like ranges or schools or whatever they're called, and you get those sort of blobby shapes that are various colors depending on the climb that you're doing, is that when it comes to the natural world and also those kinds of climbing schools, is that a lot of the climbing is one, quite random if it's outside, and two, it's very organic and flowing. Like you never truly know what shape you're grabbing in terms of just like, is it a square, is it a circle? Almost never. And you never necessarily get to choose how that became there, especially on something like El Capitan. You're just dealing with like the randomness of organic structures in the world, which is cliffs, rocks, and erosion, right? Whereas in this building, because it's architecture and because it's been designed with this sort of nod to modernism and nod to futurism, and also it's a big expensive building, you have to regiment what you're doing when you're designing. You have to produce these regimented things, and it is a repeated structure with segments. And so what that does is that as well, because you're mass producing glass and aluminium and you're trying to fit all of this facade together and make sure it fits against a lattice structure, you're handling a lot. You're producing things which are manufactured and predictable. And that's not a bad thing. It's just a form of design. And so when Alex Honnold is climbing up, you have to think about, how is this different from the usual free climbing out in the natural world? You're looking at very sort of like square things that you're looking at, very sudden flat. And if you think about your hand as it goes in, it's not just this nice sort of, I'm just grabbing a sort of rock piece or something like that, right? You've got to think like, how is he actually balancing on, let's say, the edge of something? How is he grabbing just like a flat edge like this? And what is that going to do in relation to the naturalness of something? So it's always going to be his fingers are going to be just ridiculously strong. But that's just something to bear in mind. And I think also the way he approaches the climb, he knows that he has a predictable set of segments, not segments in terms of, oh, we call this like part 1 of the climb, we call this part 2 of the climb. Oh, you know, this is like the transfer from this rock to the other. Oh, this is like the hang or something like that. It's going, okay, I can exert a certain amount of energy on 8 stories, and then it'll flare out a bit more at the top, and then I have to make this connection, and then again, and then again. So it's a little bit like how in a controlled environment like a gym, you'll do a set amount of reps and sets and things like that, against the idea of just climbing a cliff and kind of dealing with the randomness that's there. So it's interesting to contrast and think about these elements. And if you're a designer, it actually helps you to think, what is the true implication of regimentation of design, of doing these larger buildings where there's a lot of repetitive elements, versus some of the extravagant designs of like the Rococo culture, or I should say the Rococo design period, or those other kinds of design movements which are extremely sort of organic and asymmetrical and quite fluid and flowing. And the final thing that I'll say here is just, let's zoom out as the cameras were zooming out watching Alex Honnold climb up the building. This building, in my opinion, is one of the few skyscrapers that truly achieves something with skyscrapers where you're actually looking at something where the entire shape is very well considered, and it's bold and it's brave and it has a unique approach to design, but it's not a sort of failed skyscraper. And when I say that, it's a weird thing to say, isn't it? What I'm trying to say is that normally when you think about proportions in real life, like an A4 piece of paper, or like the Vitruvian Man or something, is that, or the golden ratio is basically what I'm saying, is there are these forms of design that you have to fit on a piece of paper, or you have to like fit ergonomically in someone's hand, or something like that. And it tends to follow like a ratio which is quite well balanced and is sort of, you know, this is just sort of like quite a predictable rectangle, right? But imagine if you're trying to fit something into a proportion which is extremely tall and not very wide at all. So instead of designing for that nice rectangle where you can fit a lot in, you're designing for something which is very thin and very tall. And you've got to think about how can you approach that without kind of being a bit boring, because many skyscrapers are very boring. It's just a rectangular shape and that's it. And even some of them can attempt certain approaches to getting these proportions and things and not get them quite right, or at least not be bang on perfect in my view. This building to me is an example of bang on perfection, because I feel like the segmentation that they've done with these sort of separate takeaway boxes or ingots, or you want to call them, it really feels like you could take them apart and they're a building in their own right, and they come together to give that expression of a very elegant pagoda style temple or tower shrine. And I would compare this to an achievement along the lines of I.M. Pei's Bank of China tower, which I've seen in real life, and the logic for how the geometry fits together, if you imagine them as these sort of 3D triangular pyramid shapes, was just beautiful and elegant and fitted perfectly. And I also want to give it, in terms of just like a cool ornamentation, like great ornamentation award, is similar to the Chicago Tribune Tower, which was unafraid to try some insane sort of neo-Gothic, Gothic revival approaches to a skyscraper. Okay, but I'll leave it at that because I'm pretty excited about this building. I loved watching the climb, and I hope you all really enjoyed this video and got a bit of insight into what makes this building so iconic. If you did enjoy this video, I'd highly recommend you subscribe, because my co-host Joe and I, we love to produce podcast episodes which take architecture and video games and find ways in which they interact and they overlap each other. This video has been all architecture, because sometimes we just go all on one subject or all on the other, but the podcast is about bringing those two worlds together. So if you enjoyed that, let me know what you thought of this kind of video in the comments, because as I said, this is the first thing that we've kind of done off-piste from the podcast, and if you like them, we'll do more of them, but we're just starting up. So thank you very much, everybody. This has been the Summoned Realms podcast show, except it's not the podcast, and I'll see you all again.